be ready to answer some questions. All right, perfect. Interesting. Well, let me tap out of this meeting recording. Let me give me 1 second. There we go. All right. So today we're going to talk about the definition of done. So some of you may have heard of this term. There's a lot to it. So for the lecture, we'll first talk about what the definition of done is and the components of the definition of done and why we want to strive to create a solid definition of done. We'll talk about the key benefits and cautions when creating one. We'll talk about the difference between acceptance criteria and definition of done because there are some similarities and some differences. We want to talk about how to create one that works for the team. It might not be, what we would consider excellent or super polished to begin with, but that is a-okay. We'll go through some examples and then finally finish with some common artifacts that are related to the definition of done, for instance, the definition of ready. So we will go ahead and jump in. So what is a definition of done? So a definition of done is a shared understanding set by the team of expectations that what our current iteration is, those specific standards it must meet in order to be released to our users. So the goals of done are a fewfold. So first is to build a common understanding with the team about quality and completeness. You want to be able to build a checklist that your user stories are checked against, and to ensure that the increment shipped at the end of the iteration is high quality and the quality is understood and involved by all, or understood by all involved. So think about it. I like this analogy of cleaning a house. So for instance, if you're cleaning a house or you hire someone to clean your house, you might have a different standard of cleanliness than somebody else, or your roommate or your partner or your spouse. And so it's good to have a common understanding with everybody about what do we agree that clean means? Does it mean that the windows are washed? Does it mean that the floors are vacuumed? Does it mean that you've cleaned out the sink? So definition of done is similar to that you want to have this common understanding so that you all agree what quality means, and that you can then have that agreement and then ship your code to the users. So going forth on that, how does this apply to a product team? At the end of an increment or a sprint, your team must determine that they're ready to take on the next set of tasks. So in order to fully pivot your focus and you don't have anything lingering in the back, you need to understand what done means. And this applies to every work item brought into an increment. So it's easiest to think of this in terms of user stories being done, but it also can apply to things like chores, spikes, etc. So we just want to make sure not everything will apply to every item on the checklist, but it should apply in general to most work items on your backlog. Now, why does this matter? You might think another checklist, oh, this sucks. I'm not super involved or invested in this, but the first is that it saves time, because if you have this checklist at the end that you're going to be measured against with your user stories, you're not going to have to rework anything because you didn't understand what done was in the first place. So it saves time in that you're limiting the amount of rework. And this kind of goes into the next portion of lowering rework. So imagine that you didn't know that you had to have some non-functional tests written for your user story, or that the non-functional tests needed to pass. Then you would have to go back, because your PM or the person that's reviewing your story might say hey, this doesn't meet this requirement. And then you go back, you pause on the user story you're working on now, and everything is kind of out of line. So you're lowering rework because you already have a shared understanding of what needs to get done in the first place. It drives alignment cross-functionally. So the PM and the engineers and your stakeholders all have this same understanding of what it means for a user story to be done, and you all agree on what quality means for your users. And then lastly, it provides the direction to team and stakeholders. So we know what we want from a testing standard. We know what we want from a design review standard. And so the stakeholders can then have confidence and rest assured that you've reviewed and checked off everything, and all the stories that are going to our users have quality, and the team kind of knows how to approach each user story from start to finish, from A to Z. It's not just writing the code directly in the user story all the time. Sometimes there's a design review involved or things like that. So you're giving a holistic perspective to the team and the stakeholders. Tactically, this means a checklist. So first is just providing a checklist of criteria to check user stories against. and that shared agreement with the team about what we think quality means and what we think completeness means. Remember, going back to that cleaning example, you might have a different understanding of what quality means for cleanliness and completeness means for like cleaning the house, but you need to make sure that that agreement is the same across your entire team. And then lastly, ensuring that the increment shipped at the end of an iteration meets the quality level your team and project owner or product manager or your stakeholder agrees upon. So you might right now be thinking like, well, we don't really ship at the end of each increment. Like, what does that mean? So that basically just means that like you still want to get as far as you can, knowing that like you might not have like the full pipeline done, like get it far as you can, assess your definition of done, knowing where your product is at today. So you might not have all of like the testing done because you don't have everything set up. That's fine. Just know that you're going to need to rework your definition of done when your pipeline is set up and you start shipping at the end of each sprint. Who determines it? So the product team must determine it. It's not just like one person on the team. It's not just the product manager going down and saying like, hey, this is what I've determined is the definition of done. Every single person should have input on what done means. So it's not a stakeholder. It's not like you might not even know what a scrum master is, but it's not like a project manager or a team manager or development manager, but it's the product team. It's a balanced team. It's all the designers, all the engineers, all the PMs are the ones that say, hey, this is what we agree on, is what definition of done means. And I like this quote here is like, when a backlog item or an increment is described as done, one must understand what done means. So what do we all consider to be done? Now, what can this look like? So from a checklist perspective, this is very high level, but this is a lot of the common themes we see in a definition of done. So has a unit test been written and passed? Has the code been reviewed by someone else other than the person who made the story? Has the acceptance criteria for each issue been met? Are the functional tests that have been written passed? Are non-functional requirements met? So system performance, loading time, all of that. And has the product manager accepted the user story? So this is not comprehensive, and our team might have different criteria based on what we value. So with that being said, I'm going to switch my sharing here shortly and hop over to Mentimeter and let me know if there are other things that you might consider as part of the definition of done. All right, so we have 2 responses. This is like, there's really no right or wrong answer. Just know that like this is once the code is basically complete, which is also part of the definition of done. All right, so the item is tested. Yes, item is reviewed and part of the main branch. That one's also definitely possible. Executable proof of correctness. Integration tests are passed when the stakeholders say we are. And so, well, that one's interesting. We'll go back to that. Have we confirmed the new code doesn't break any security standards? That's great. CI/CD pipeline, tested, integrated. Yeah, so a lot of themes here with like specific testing standards. So it's great to like have testing on your mind and great to understand like what are the testing standards that we agree are done and what testing standards do we agree is quality. When the stakeholders say we are, I would disagree with that one. I mean, that could be part of your definition of done, but I would highly recommend against it because the team should be deciding when the code is the right quality and making that agreement and that shared understanding. Who wrote executable proof of correctness? I'm curious if you can speak a little bit more on that.
Yeah, executable proof of correctness. I'm just priming people. I'm going to be doing a talk on acceptance testing. So the executable proof of correctness would be that the requirements are codified in such a way that you can verify them automatically. So it's sort of like the step beyond integration testing.
I like that. Thank you, Dale. Test coverage covers appropriate amount of code per Chicago style testing. That's also fairly specific, but I like that. I like the one that also calls out design and UI is reviewed to ensure it matches Figma and other sources. Who wrote that one?
I wrote that one just because you can code something, but that doesn't mean it's what's specified by Figma and by other sources. I was kind of referring to, for instance, how we had the sync, for example, like what should be in each field, making sure like, hey, if this thing shouldn't accept numbers or something like that. Does it actually not accept numbers? Or special characters or something like that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that one's good too. Like looking back at like that validation matrix that we created and saying like, does it actually meet these standards? So I think that one's really important too, because a lot of times like you just assume that when you're building something from Figma, that it's going to match 1-for-1, but obviously like the engineers know it's not as simple as that. So like having a design review portion of the definition of done, like has the designer gotten their eyes on it? Or if it's like data related, has like the PM looked at it or tested it? So I like that. And documentation being completed is also definitely a good one too. Like we probably won't be considered done if like things like our user manuals haven't been updated. Like we want to push something to production if we haven't updated all of our material that our user might see. So these are all really great examples. And we'll go through some live examples as well further on in the lecture. So jumping back in, to wrap up this, like what is the definition of done portion, I want to end on one of my favorite examples, which is a relay. I always try to do all these like running analogies when I can. So imagine you're running like a 4x100 running relay, and you're one of like, you're either the coach or you're one of the person, like you're one of the runners doing this leg. Everybody might have different understandings of what done might mean. So like to an individual runner, that means I've handed the baton off. To someone else, it means I've successfully like grabbed it and passed it to the next person, things like that. But like, which of these ones will like be the overall arching portion of done? And that's like finishing the race, winning the gold. So everybody might have different ideas of what done means. Like an engineer might think like, hey, I'm done when I've like finished my code, written all my tests, and I've passed it off. And the designer might think I'm done when I've like reviewed all the designs and like checked off on that. And the PM might say like, I've accepted it. But like having that all documented and like having this one overall arching checklist that we can all agree that done means creates that big picture of like winning the gold or finishing the race. All right, so moving on to key benefits and cautions of a definition of done. So I will say that I think the benefits here largely outweigh some of the cautions, which we will get into after we talk about the benefits. So there's transparency of responsibilities. You know what you need to do and what you don't need to do. So this is super helpful. I like when we think back to like agile, lean, like what you're doing is just as, if not less important than like what you're not doing. So this makes it really clear, like where does my line in the sand end, and I can pass it off to the next person. And it's really transparent. The next is you have a realistic iteration commitment. Like if you know that you need to put in a certain amount of tests, or you know that like this, like the further portion is going to take a lot more time than just like actually writing the code, then you'll be able to accurately estimate and have a proper commitment to your iteration and what you think you can get done compared to not having a definition of done. Reduced risk of rework. We've already talked about this. Having a checklist makes it really clear like what you need to get done. So having that before you even start on the ticket makes it a lot more clear about what needs to happen, so you don't have to go back if you forget something. Higher quality and less effort everywhere. So once we get better at this, we'll actually be able to automate a lot of this. So when you're spinning up a product, you know, a lot of the testing you're doing manually, a lot of like the non-functional testing too. So like system testing, load testing, requirements, etc., are being done like manually. And as we get better at these practices, like we can start to automate a ton of the definition of done. So as we get better at this, you know, we can automate portions of these testing and these requirements. You know, we can have tests that actually check the UI, things like that, which will save time and make our quality a lot higher everywhere. And then lastly, predictability and sustainability of pace. So we know with a definition of done, we'll likely have fewer defects, fewer people going back to do rework. Therefore, we'll have value with the whole team, and we won't have people diverting to address so many bugs. So overall, there's a lot of benefits to agreeing what your definition of done is. However, there are some cautions. The first being out of sight, out of mind. So having a definition of done and never reviewing it will likely mean that you just don't do it. And I think that this actually happens quite a bit. So we've seen this happen. I've seen this happen a lot where we like make one, we create it, great, and then we never look at it ever again, because there are way too many things that are clamoring for our attention. So we want to keep it at the front of your mind and make sure to review it periodically so we don't forget about it. The second is too much too soon. So if we're doing these crazy definition of done checklists, like, we're updating our marketing materials every time we're releasing, and we're updating like every single little bit of like our documentation immediately, like that's probably too much too soon. We want to start small with a very like simple checklist, or else we might just be like overburdened by it and unable to achieve much of it. So we want to just, like I said, keep it simple at first and keep it visible, and then we can iterate from there. Any questions before we move on to talk about the difference between definition of done and acceptance criteria? All right, AC versus DOD. So actually, before we jump in, does someone want to come off of mute and tell me what they believe is the difference between definition of done and acceptance criteria?
I would say for me, acceptance criteria is, does the code do what we want it to do? The definition of done would be more of, does that chunk of work fit into the larger scheme of maneuver that's going on with the product itself? So acceptance criteria, does it do what we need to do? Definition of done, does it fit in seamlessly to everything else that's going on?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Dane. And kind of going off what Dane said, it's like, if we think about our work items, our user stories, our features and issues, like everything there is like unique to the piece of value that we're adding to the user. So like, as Dane said, it's like the code we're writing, the work we're doing. So that's all unique. And like each individual work item will be checked against its own criteria that like the product manager has decided. The definition of done is applicable to every single user story. So it's a checklist that doesn't change, it's static until you decide to update it, but it applies to every single user story. So we think of like acceptance criteria is unique to the story, definition of done is not unique, and it's checked against all work items. So if we think about this, definition of done applies to all your work, whereas the acceptance criteria only ever applies to a single item on your backlog. The definition of done clarifies what we do as a team. So it's like holistic to how is design involved? How is product management involved? How are the engineers involved in what they're doing? Whereas acceptance criteria just clarifies what the product does and what its functionality is. And then lastly, definition of done can contain criteria for non-functional aspects. So we think about like, how should the system perform? How quickly should things load, etc. And then the acceptance criteria talk about functional aspects of a single item of work. So, what specifically should this body of work be doing within our product? And another way to look at it, user stories must pass the definition of done before they trot off into the sunset in production environment. So this is like, the definition of done is like the bouncer to get into a club. You cannot get into the production club until you've checked off all of this criteria. All right, so every story will contain its own unique acceptance criteria and pass the definition of done before getting into the hands of users. So think about it as definition of done, club bouncer. All right, love it or hate it. So how to create a definition of done that works. So this is really, it's not very hard. It's collectively decided upon by the team. So the first step here is deciding on the criteria with your team. So while defining done should include input from the product team, so your QA, if you have that, we contain QA to our own balance team right now, or our stakeholders, it's ultimately up to the technical team to decide what it means. Create a checklist. So once you've decided what your criteria is, turn it into a checklist. Put it somewhere that's visible, and make sure that your definition of done is the minimum work required to your agreed upon quality level. So when you're deciding on the criteria, you're basically saying, what does quality mean? And how do we test for quality? and then share it out. So like I said, you want to make it visible and available to anyone, and there should be transparency around why those requirements are the ones that you chose. So make sure that it's accessible to anybody. It's not hidden anywhere. I recommend printing it and posting it somewhere, because it's people aren't going to remember to actually look at it if it's hidden in like a folder somewhere buried into like a drive. So recommend, like, at least if you don't print it, share it every so often, maybe like once a month, once every 2 weeks, at like a pre-IPM or an IPM, just to make sure that, like, hey, are we actually adhering to these standards? And on that note, fourth step is reviewing it often, but not obsessing over it. So if you have too many definition of done items, our team's attention is just going to be split. We're going to be unable to focus. So we want to have that right mix of like the right amount of items for us that we think are valuable and important. And lastly, and probably I would argue most importantly, is continue to focus on acceptance criteria, because that's like the gold standard of like what we're delivering to our users, and the team will know what they need to work on. And it makes it much easier to clearly tick off the AC portion met of our definition of done, and the rest should all fall into place if you have that solid shared upon agreement that we will have set through steps 1 and 4. So the evolution of a definition of done, your definition of done isn't going to be like 5 stars at first. That like would be kind of like overburdening the team and like not realistic at all. So, you know, if we think about it in terms of like stars, so like a 1-star definition of done is one that probably just like doesn't exist. And everyone determines their own work is finished when, you know, they draw their own line in the sand. Now, if we take a step up in quality, we have a repeatable, but not all treated equally sort of checklist that expectations could be documented, but they're not always applied. So at least we're like talking about it, but it's not all necessarily like checked off in the same way. So only some stories that have UI might be getting reviewed versus like every single story that has a piece of UI work is getting reviewed by a designer. 3 stars is defined and consistent. So expectations are documented and applied, but might be too robust or constricting. So for instance, if we say that we're doing all this testing and we're reviewing this and we're updating all of our documentation, like we might be too constricting if we're saying every single piece of documentation that needs to be updated, or too robust if we're, you know, saying that all of these different things need to be tested and all these systems need to be checked. A step up from that is capable and measurable. So when we talk about capable and measurable, we want to make sure that like we're gathering metrics, like X percentage of our stories have met system requirements, or things like that, where we're like design reviewing 100% of our stories. So we want to actually start to build that story using our data, and then make it visible, accessible, and applied. And then the last step is efficient and optimizing. 5 stars. We've achieved all other steps in this creation of our definition of done, and we've actually started like automating part of this process. Like we've, you know, put in automatic tests that are run every time we promote to a specific environment or things like that. Or like we have a way to automatically update our documentation every time a story reaches our staging level. All of that is great. And that means that you're automating processes and you're making your team work a lot more efficiently. Okay, so on that note, very transparent Mentimeter, we are going to move on to the next question, which is how many stars would you rate your team's current definition of done? So some might be a little bit lower. You might say like, I know we created it, but we haven't really talked about it, or like we've created it and I think we do it, but it's not great, or like we haven't even set one at all. But I'm just curious to get some feedback from the team and be fully transparent. I would be shocked if anybody put 5 stars here, but let me know what your thoughts are. All right, we see some 1s and we see some 2s. More 1s and 2s right now. We got a 3, awesome. This is turning out to be like a very, oh no, not anymore. I was gonna say it's quite linear. Okay, so it seems like 2s are the general consensus, although there are a couple 1s, which might be from a team that just hasn't agreed on it. Can someone who voted 2 chime in and explain why they believe that their definition of done is a 2?
So I put down 2. And it's definitely, like we've gone through, we did our definition of done. And we have it, but I think more on me, I need to make it more well known, like you're saying, like periodically bring it back up and be like, all right, guys, let's go over this. Let's just show it to you again and everything. Like you said, maybe print it out. But yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, and that's not only on you, Cubisco, like anybody on the team can feel empowered to go ahead and print it and make it shareable too. But thank you for chiming in. Anybody else? Or anybody that voted a 1 or a 3?
So I said 1 just because we don't really have our definition of done really like documented and placed anywhere. But I will say there's kind of the caveat that at least among the dev team, there's even though it's not documented, like a shared understanding of what needs to happen before something's considered done. Like it's our, I guess, norm that, hey, like you run your tests, you run your integration tests, you pull it up, make sure it's functioning like it should. But I just said that because it's not really, I guess, documented anywhere.
That's fair. Ian, you might not have been part of like the original one. I did run this exercise through with Swarm, and I'll share it at the end, like the Miro board that we did. But because there are so many new people as part of the team, it could definitely be worth just like redoing it from scratch. And saying like, now that we have new people, we have like new standards of quality and all of that. All right, jumping back into the lecture. So and I lost my window. 1 second. Oh, I guess I never switched my sharing, so I apologize for that. So let me actually share what our answers were here. So we have 4 people that voted for 1, 7 people that voted for 2, and 1 person that voted 3. So most of the people are in agreement here that we're at about a 2. We have some majority that we could definitely improve upon, but everybody's thinking in the right kind of like frame of mind, basically saying that like, hey, we do have these standards, like as Ian mentioned, like we do talk about testing, we do design reviews, but there's definitely some standardization that can happen. So on that note, we're kind of at somewhere between a 1 and a 3. How can we make it stick a little bit better when we create a definition of done? First step is keep it visible. Hang it on a wall, tape it to the inside of your bathroom doors of the wavelength office, the coffee counter. You want to make it hard to miss and forget. Automate it. So much of this definition of done can and should be automated, even just like completing the checklist. The pipeline can tell us that the tests are passing, if security requirements are met, code coverage, etc. So where we can automate, we should definitely look to do that. Keep it short and sweet, especially in the beginning when we set a definition of done. We want to celebrate those easy wins. So even with a simple yes is just like crucial to establishing these like new habits and getting used to it. Refer to it often. So naturally bring this up in like IPMs and pre-IPMs when, I know Cubisco uses like a weekly check column in Linear. So like every story that gets done throughout the week goes into this column before it moves to done. So at the next the next IPM every Monday, we look back at the previous week and say, hey, this is all we've accomplished. That would be a great time to say like, hey, does everything here meet the standards before we start talking about the upcoming week? So I think that's a great opportunity to refer to it often. And then lastly, only raise the bar when you're ready. So update it and make sure that you like consistently look at it and celebrate when you do. But if we're slipping, then it might be time to update it. So make sure you're just only updating it when you're ready. Now, a hot topic here is, are all definition of done items mandatory? And the answer is probably not. Because if you have a checklist where everything is just like easily getting checked off, then it's probably not really worth it. So some items should be marked as mandatory, and those should be done for every work item, no exceptions. However, I would argue for a product team, those things that we check off every time are probably some of the least useful ones. So I would say that like you should have a checklist. Some things should be mandatory, but not all. Like we're not going to have a design review for every work item. But it should be part of our checklist. It should only apply to stories that have UI. It shouldn't apply to like chores or like setting up the API or things like that. So there should definitely be items that are mandatory for each work item, but not every item on the checklist will be mandatory. So want to jump into 2 examples. One is like a very standard example. It's probably like a 3 out of 5 stars. The other one is like way more mature and detailed. It's probably closer to 4 or 5, but like you'll see the difference in the 2 and it's quite overwhelming. So you'll understand that like these 2 teams might be in different places. So this is the first simple and straightforward example. So the checklist here is design documents have been completed and approved. Your code has been developed. Any guides or instructions have been completed. Testing has been completed. All of your defects are resolved. Your release notes are complete. The AC has been met and the product accepted. Your change control documentation is complete and it's been deployed to production. So that seems like fairly straightforward. It's great because you're not really missing anything, but it's still like getting us all the way to deploy to the production environment. So that's good. It's not getting us like almost to the finish line. It's getting us across the finish line. So I think this is a great one that would be more for like a new team that's just started deploying and just wants to keep it high level and make sure that they're checking things off and still accomplishing quality. Now, if we look at like a more mature and updated definition of done, we see something more crazy like this. So this is like probably a larger company that has really specific departments, like there's a marketing department that you have to interact with, or like a customer success department that needs to know when changes happen so they can talk to your users. So a couple examples here. So they're talking about the tooling they're using. So they talk about GitHub issues being closed or completed. They talk about like if it's a tech support issue that those are circled back on and they're closed in a specific channel. So you can resolve those in a Slack channel. They talk about all the testing that happens in different environments, deployed to production with no obvious errors. And once a PR is deployed, the engineers must keep an eye on the Slack channel to show our exceptions. So they're talking about kind of like what behaviors are we practicing to ensure quality here. Marketing department has been updated. So, and if it's like a bug fix, it's been recorded in a spreadsheet. So marketing's aware. So like a lot of these things you might see like, wow, this is like an awesome definition of done, but like, this is not applicable to us right now at all. Like if we go back to this simple example, this is going to get us a lot further and celebrating a lot more wins than something more detailed like this. Now, eventually, you know, down the road in 5 years, when Wavelength has 45 product teams and we're conquering all the AOCs with all of our awesome products, then we might have something more detailed like this, but it's going to take time and we want to celebrate our wins first and then take steps to incrementally improve it over time. Also, this is just like, I think a little excessive in my opinion. All right, now wrapping up, we're going to pivot from like definition of done to some other common artifacts that will help us get to that definition of done and deploying quality in the production environment. So some of the common artifacts include swim lanes and statuses for our workflow. So this is like having a really clear linear board set up with really clear swim lanes and knowing who does what in each different swim lane and who owns those columns and who's responsible for moving things from this column to the next column. Having your team's software development lifecycle process documented. Really important here because then once again, you understand who owns what. Your definition of done agreement. And lastly, your DOR agreement. Can somebody here tell me what DOR means?
Release is the definition of release.
Not release. So think about the opposite of done. Like
Ready.
Ready?
Yeah, there we go. Definition of ready. So what is the definition of ready? It's like almost the opposite of the definition of done. It's a shared upon checklist that knows that something is worth starting in the first place. So if we think about like our pre-IPMs, you know, we probably want to have a shared agreement of like something that's ready to actually be reviewed and started upon as a user story. So it supports a stronger approach that only starting work has met a particular test of readiness and will ultimately mitigate the risk of the DoD not being done all the way down there. So jump back into Mentimeter. It's a quick little quiz and I will share my screen again here and move on to the next question. There we go. What of this list is not possibly part of a definition of ready? So think about this, think about all these options of getting ready to start working on a piece of work. All right, we have a lot of people saying the acceptance criteria has been met is not part of the definition of ready. Edge cases have been considered, all right? All right, we will reveal the answer. So whoever marked acceptance criteria has been met is correct, because we want to talk about getting a story ready to be worked on. Acceptance criteria being met should be part of the definition of done. Like, hey, we've actually worked on the story and the AC has been met. Whereas like a story has been pointed, that might mean it's ready to be worked on. Edge cases have been considered. We've talked through all the edge cases on a user story. And if you guys don't know what edge cases mean, it's like a happy path is everything that should happen in a user story, like the steps that the user will take normally to accomplish. And edge case is like something that the user might kind of like go off the rails with, and we might want to consider like negative use cases, like what happens if they click the wrong button or the screen errors out. That's an edge case. So we want to consider those as part of the definition of ready. And lastly, if there is a design and it's a UI story or a full stack vertical slice, we definitely want to think about attaching designs to the story. All right, so on that note, how does this apply to our team? So this will help us ensure success that we have completed user story. If we talk about designs being attached, edge cases being considered, pointing a story, we know what the effort is and all the testing we need to consider. Like that will help us be successful. When we talk about all these user stories, we meet this checklist of ready, that makes sure that we've like put enough thought into actually building the story. And lastly, the primary output of IPM will be a prioritized list of work items. And all these work items in our prioritized backlog should meet this definition of ready. So it would also bring focus to the pre-IPM meetings, because we know everything that comes to pre-IPM will be structured in a way that will make it ready to be worked on. Although definitely don't take away from those free-flowing thoughts of like, hey, do we need to add a chore? Do we need to add a spike for things? Like that's also organic and might be separate from the definition of ready. So we have talked the definition of done. We've talked about what makes a good definition of done, some cautions, how to create one, what do we think our current definition of done is. We've walked through examples. We've talked about, on the flip side, the definition of ready and some of the other artifacts that are common here. Are there any questions on any of this? All right. Okay. Feel free to chime in. While you're chiming in, I do want to share what one of the teams has done already. So just give me one moment. Okay, so this is what we had the Swarm team run through back in, I want to say this is a while ago, so January or February. So all of these activities have been placed in the hands of your PMs. So if you feel like your definition of done or ready should be updated, or if you haven't created one, should be created, look to your PM, but this is obviously a collective team exercise to run this exercise. So for instance, now, next, and later, like you want to have maybe different instances of like what you can do now, but then also what you want to strive for in the future. So for now, like when we created this in January or February, it was only 6 items. It was very simple and straightforward, but then we added more items down here because we knew that like once we onboarded on a Kessel Run, then we'll be able to like add specific security requirements and things like that we wouldn't be able to initially do. So things to take into consider. And then, you know, a more mature one, like we talk about product performance, regression tests, documentation, all of that. Now, jumping into the definition of ready. Similarly, we had one for now and the future, where we have something that can be completed in one iteration. We've considered edge cases, everything like that. But then in the future, we also added in like metrics and analytics. We knew that we weren't at a point in time to integrate with like the Dragon analytics and Kessel Run. So we wanted to wait to add that to our definition of ready, but definitely something to strive for in the future. And then what this can look like. Oh, let me see if I can find it. Yeah. What this looks like as an output that you can then print is throwing this into a spreadsheet and making it easy to pull up, or you can print it and put it in your office and then knowing when you can revisit it. So maybe once a quarter, you go back and you take a look at it and you say, hey, actually, I think we're ready to start looking at our security requirements and adding that to our definition of done. So having these in different timing columns helps to understand kind of what you're striving for, but being realistic about what's happening now. And then having it in a form like this makes it easy to print, share, bring up in a meeting, etc. Are there any questions in general on the definition of done? Concerns, etc.
I guess I do.
Yeah.
I'm gonna be the bull in the china shop here for just a few minutes, not
Sure.
minutes. I'm not gonna talk that long. I was the one that actually wrote the what was it, when the stakeholders say we're done.
Yeah.
Because I think maybe one perspective to have on this, because I think ultimately like everything that we've just been taught is like really solid advice for like having a functional team. Because like it's built on cooperation and trust and just having really good skills, but at the end of the day, like there's someone is writing the paychecks and you're at the mercy of them. If they like, if you complete all the tasks, you like, we just looked at the definition of done with all the different like parameters that we have to meet. We can meet
Yeah.
all those parameters, give it to the customer, and they'll just be like, yeah, this isn't finished. And then it's back to the drawing board again. And if we tell them, no, well, actually we're done, they're like, okay, well then we're not gonna be using this product anymore. And now it's like, now you're kind of out of a task, and
Yeah.
you're kind of at the mercy of them because they're the ones kind of, writing the check. There was something funny yesterday. I think it was Ryan. We were talking about Fortify for the pipeline, and we were talking about like the sort of security measures at play. And he talked about someone he knew who like would like leave like a security backdoor so that if anyone was like, actually we don't like your product anymore, we're not going to pay you for it. And it's like, okay, well, I'm just going to sneak in and break your website. I thought that was a funny story. I just think it's something to keep in mind is like, there's a power dynamic at play between the stakeholder and the team. And it's something
Yeah.
that should be taken in consideration when you're, making your product and, figuring out where to draw the line, I think.
Yeah. Definitely. So thanks for sharing, Cody. And I think there are a couple of thoughts there. And I would say like, if like, you're not wrong, I would say, let's not equate like what we put into production though, with like user research and feedback at the same time. So like with the definition of done, we want to make sure that like everything that we give to our user and like put in their hands is quality and isn't gonna like be super buggy or crash on them or like be a poor user experience. Now, that being said, there can always be the case where you have something that works perfectly fine and like there are no bugs and the user still dislikes it. And that's where we want to have like a really strong like user research. We want to do all of like our design and like research up front to mitigate that. So it's almost like there are continual like wheels turning that like Caden and Zach are doing all of like their good design and research work up front to make sure that down the road, like when we do deliver, it's what they want. Meanwhile, like when we're working on stories, the definition of done helps to make sure that like what we've actually agreed to deliver is actually quality. And we're not like sneaking through with like a bug that's going to crash production. So at the end of the day, like, yes, we're at the mercy of what our users and our stakeholders like kind of like say, mostly hopefully our users and hopefully our stakeholders trust our processes enough. There's going to always be the chance where like maybe our research was wrong and what our original assumption and experiment was proven false when we put something into production. But with our definition of done, like hopefully at least it's not because of like poor performance or like a buggy UI or anything like that. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, of course. I mean, we should still hold ourselves to a high standard,
Yeah,
I'm just glad that our stakeholders in particular are just awesome people who are just their understanding of our first, of our like, at least when it comes to Swarm, at least. I'm just glad that our stakeholders are understanding of like the roadblocks we've run into, and they're just as excited to get the product out as we are. I mean, of course,
Yeah,
whatever they
100%.
were using before isn't the best, probably. So
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Cody. Any other questions or comments here? All right. So what I'm going to do when this lecture has been processed up by the Zoom gods, we will put it in the Slack channel so you guys can all refer back to it. But in that note, I will also include like this Miro activity and this Google Sheet in case you want to take this back to your team and revise it. Every team is at like a different spot with their definition of done. So didn't want to like rerun this exercise from scratch since some of the baseline already exists here. So take this and revisit it with your teams. I will task the product managers for at least bringing up the topic with each individual team if they have not within the past like month, so that we can revisit it and make sure that we're all aligned on what each team needs to put something quality into your environment. And if nobody has any other questions, I will let you go a little bit early, but please reach out if you have any questions or follow-ups from today's lecture. Alrighty, thank you, everyone. Happy Wednesday.
happy birthday.
Thank you.